free the land on another great day of resistance. On this day, St. Patrick's Day, I will be honoring the freedom fighters of the Montserrat Slave Rebellion, led by a great brave revolutionary African by the name of Cudjoe, and other enslaved Africans that were brought to the Caribbean island of Montserrat, an island that was colonized by the Irish and the British Empire. So on this day, I will be saluting the 9 martyrs of the slave rebellion who sacrificed their lives to overthrow the Irish enslavers in the British Empire. The Montserrat Island, also known as the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean Seas, is an island that was colonized by 3 different nations of Europeans. One of those nations was the British Empire. The other nation was the French Empire. And last but not least, the Irish settlers who came to the island in the 17th century, and they overtook the island by the 1630s. Along with those Irish settlers were brought with them enslaved Africans from several different places off the West African coast. Most of these Africans were also Igbo enslaved peoples that were brought to this island from different places in the Caribbean island and other places from West Africa. But majority of the time on the island was colonized by the British Empire. Also, the Montserrat Caribbean island also has deep connections to the early days of the Virginia colony of the Virginia settlers, who were also a mixed breed of Irish and English peoples. See, many people don't know that the Irish and the British had a mixture of peoples who were going around invading different lands and colonizing lands. So also, the early periods of time of the British colonization of the Montserrat Island, they also looked towards Virginia and the Virginia slavery system to bring those plantation owners to the island of Montserrat, Caribbean island, to bring order and to also grow tobacco, cotton, and indigo. The Montserrat Island was already known for its sugarcane fields. So when those first Montserrat enslaved African peoples were brought to the island, they were brought there to work in the sugarcane fields. But at that point in period of time, there was a terminology called indentured servants. But you got to understand that indentured servants was a name that was given to white people who were paid to work and labor in the fields. So the indentured servant terminology didn't apply to African peoples or what you call melanated peoples, because we know the difference in the slavery systems, that black people, African people, were treated like slaves and not humans. So the indentured servant title means nothing when it comes to the Montserrat history of slavery. Being that the Montserrat history is heavily tied to the Virginia settlers, Irish plantation owners, and the British Empire, it has a steep history of Virginia's harsh ways of enslaving other peoples. Also in this history is tied to a great African from the West African nation of Igbo land, one of the most famous enslaved peoples, Aquino, who was also owned by a Montserrat Irish settler owner. By the 1760s, the Irish slave plantation owners had brought so many enslaved African people to the island that these enslaved people started to outnumber the British and the Irish 3-1. St. Patrick's Day, which is a celebration that the Irish brought from their homeland to the island. But this St. Patrick's Day on the Montserrat Island symbolizes something totally different when it comes to celebration. This celebration is to honor and venerate these 9 martyrs, led by one of those great freedom fighters by the name of Cudjoe, who started to plot, plan, and strategize the slave rebellion for March 17, 1768. These enslaved peoples thought that they could catch the Irish slave plantation owners off guard because they knew that they was going to be heavily intoxicated off drinking a lot of Irish beer. So on that day, over 30 enslaved African peoples plot, planned, and strategized the rebellion and initiated the rebellion by raiding the governor's house on the island and stealing weapons, rocks, swords, and things of that nature that they could use to attack the plantation owners. But this slave rebellion, like many other slave rebellions in history, was informed on. It was informed on by an Irish woman who put out the call to the Irish and the British Empire that a slave rebellion was going down on that date. So the Irish were prepared for these enslaved Africans, being that the Irish slave plantation owners and the British Empire quailed the slave rebellion back. On that same day, March 17, 1768, they would capture the leaders of the slave rebellion, led by a courageous freedom fighter by the name of Cudjoe and 9 other slave rebellion leaders. But overall, 30 enslaved peoples were captured for the slave rebellion, all executed. But the most horrific execution of them all was the execution of the slave rebellion leader Cudjoe, whose head they cut off and put on a stake to show the enslaved peoples of the island to never ever rebel against the British Empire and the Irish settlers of the island. But also something more powerful that shows on March 17, 1768 is that the St. Patrick's Day celebration symbolizes something totally different. It symbolizes an African celebration and veneration of these 9 martyrs of the Montserrat Slave Rebellion, which they would bring into existence a masquerade called a Montserrat Masquerade. And if you notice this masquerade, it symbolizes, and it also identical to the Igbo masquerades in Nigeria. These masquerades on the Montserrat Island symbolize and honor and venerate those 9 martyrs of the Montserrat Slave Rebellion, where these enslaved African peoples would get together, put on costumes, put on masks that represent the deities from the homelands that they came from, and they honor these great freedom fighters. If you also notice in the masquerades, notice the traditional African wear that they got on that is similar to the Igbo traditional wear. So on this day, we honor and venerate and honor those freedom fighters who were executed and those Africans who rose up against the Irish.